Hey guys, and welcome back to Hoosier Hardware, and today we're taking a look at an older GPU that came out 8 years ago this month, and that would be the Radeon HD 7970 GHz Edition. For those of you still hanging on to one or looking to pick one up, let's see if it still holds its own in 2020. So this GPU is a beast. It kind of has a retro by 2020 standards look to it with this sort of glossy black and red plastic all over. It still has that sort of blower style fan on it. It's a pretty large card. It's about the same size as my 1080 Ti that I run in my main rig. Obviously the difference being that this only has one fan. It's a blower style card versus a dual fan card in the EVGA 1080 Ti SC2. As I mentioned in the intro, this thing came out back in 2012, in June of 2012, at around $500 when it first launched. It's based on a 28 nanometer process, GCN 1.0, has a 300 watt TDP, and to run this card you need an 8-pin and a 6-pin PCIe power connector. Now as we look at some modern games today, I do want to point out this card is actually older than the current generation of consoles. We're talking about a card that came out before, well before, the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One whatsoever. So we are definitely looking at a card that, at least from a timeline perspective in tech, it is very long in the tooth, but it also did cost $500 by itself. So if you would put $500 into this graphics card in 2012, it'll be interesting to see just how well it holds its own here in these modern titles, and really looking at it backwards from the 2020 perspective, looking back at 2012, would you have been happy with spending $500 on this card, especially when we look at modern performance? Now, one of the things that this card does have going for it, because in 2012, VRAM sizes were much smaller, obviously, than they are today, this thing did still have 3 gigabytes of VRAM on board. So even though modern titles can definitely push well past that 3 gigabyte mark, obviously if you're going to upgrade, get something with more VRAM, but 2012 card having 3 gigabytes is pretty solid. So for our testing today, the test bench that we're working with has 16 gigabytes of DDR4 memory running at 3000 megahertz, and we have a Ryzen 9 3900X running at a fixed 4.0 gigahertz across all 12 of its cores. Now, being in such an older GPU, the CPU is not going to hold this thing back whatsoever, even though I could absolutely clock the 3900X a little bit higher across all cores, or even let Precision Boost just give it 1 or 2 cores that have a little bit more speed than the rest. I could absolutely get the 3900X to run a little bit faster than I ran it at, but it's absolutely not going to hold this card back. So to start us off, we're going to go with the very popular, at least coming up in popularity, Valorant. I ran this title at high settings at 1080p, and frankly, this game can run on a potato. The HD 7970 GHz Edition just ran this game absolutely flawlessly. It was a fantastic experience. I actually completely forgot I was benchmarking as I went through this game, because there was no indication that this hardware was older whatsoever. So obviously the average frame rate 1% and 0.1% lows were extremely good in this title. Moving on to Fortnite, I started running this title on the high graphics preset, and that's just because I like to run this game with some eye candy and make it look really, really good. And if you're that type of person, you're gonna see a really solid average frame rate here of above 60. 1% low is just barely below 60 there at 57, and the 0.1% low is still pretty solid, especially considering the age of this GPU at 43. But if you're somebody that likes to run this game on the lower settings to get as many frames as possible, you're gonna see really excellent results from this GPU in Fortnite, seeing an average frame rate there of 159, a 1% low of 115, and a 0.1% low of 84. And then the last of our mostly multiplayer focused titles here, we have Call of Duty Warzone on just normal settings. This is not a preset, this is just manually putting in most of the settings on that normal range. Saw an average FPS here of 68, 1% low of 52, and a 0.1% low of 44. Again, this was a really solid experience. Obviously, in a competitive game, you're going to want to have as many frames as absolutely possible. And while you're not getting a huge number on that average, you are definitely getting an average frame rate that's going to at least allow you to be competitive in this title. Now, moving to the Metro Exodus built-in benchmark using the low preset at 1080p, we saw an average FPS of 66 and a 1% low there of 31. This title is, while playable, you're definitely going to see a wide variety of frame rate changes depending on where your location is. If you're indoors in a lower demanding area, you're going to see frame rates well above 60, but at the same time, if you're out in a brightly lit area with a lot happening on screen, you're going to see a lower frame rate, and it is going to be noticeable just because you're dealing with frames that are going from 60, 70, possibly even 80 frames per second all the way down in a very short time span, down to potentially in the low 30s or even lower. So this game is definitely playable, but it may be a little bit jarring to the point where I would actually recommend just setting a max frame rate if you're playing a game like this at maybe 30 FPS so you don't notice those huge swings in frame rates. Red Dead Redemption 2 was up next, where with the built-in benchmark on the low settings, we saw an average frame rate of 31, a 1% low of 17, and a 0.1% low of 14. This title I would not classify as playable, at least at the settings that I was using there. Obviously, we do still have a little bit of room to drop down resolution a little bit more, and maybe even some of those settings you can knock down to the lowest that they can absolutely go. But basically here at 1080p, Red Dead Redemption 2 is going to be a tough sell on the 7970 GHz edition. And then rounding out our benchmarking is Borderlands 3, and Borderlands 3 seems to really hit the CPU heavy if you're running a CPU that, especially one that only has 4 cores and 4 threads, but with the 3900X on this system, this title really wasn't a problem for the 7970 here. We saw an average FPS of 55, a 1% low of 45, and that 0.1% low was down there at 17, and that does indicate there was a stutter just here and there, but it definitely wasn't all that common in this built-in benchmark. So this is definitely a playable game. If you're somebody that's trying to hit that 60 FPS mark, there's probably just a little bit of room, whether you're dropping a resolution or dropping some of the settings down to the lowest possible settings you can get. You could probably get to an average of 60 FPS. But if you're just playing through this game, no faster pace than Borderlands 3 generally is, you're probably gonna be just fine. It's not like a CSGO or a Valorant or one of these extremely fast-paced titles that you need ultra fast reaction times. This frame rate is just fine for Borderlands 3, and I would call this absolutely playable on the 7970 GHz edition. So those benchmarks kind of lead us into what I guess becomes the conclusion of this video, and talking about the 7970 GHz edition. If you spent $500 in 2012 and you're still rolling with the 7970 in 2020, I would say you absolutely got your value out of this card. For the first half of its lifetime, it's probably been able to run pretty much every game out there at either maxed out settings or very near maxed out settings at 1080p. And if you've upgraded to 1440p, then yeah, this card is going to be needing to be replaced if you're wanting to continue to play AAA titles at that resolution. But even then, some of the older titles would run absolutely fine at 1440p on a card like this. Thinking about something like Skyrim would probably run no problem at 1440p on a card like the 7970 GHz edition. Now, when we look at 2020 titles, AAA titles that are very demanding in-game, the 7970 is really starting to show its age, where it's just barely able to get playable frame rates in some of these modern titles at 1080p. And if we're really trying to hit that 60 FPS mark, the 7970 is past its prime. It's not really a card you're going to want to pick up here in 2020, especially considering the pricing of these cards. You can get better options on the used market than the 7970 GHz edition. You can pick up RX 480s, the 4GB or even the 8GB variants for comparable prices. Yes, you probably are going to pay just a little bit more for the RX 480 or an RX 580, but at the same time, you're gonna get better performance from those cards in modern AAA titles. Now, if you're looking at just mostly esports titles, the 7970 is still holding its own just fine, and you're still getting really good frames there. And at that point, it really does come down to the price to performance comparison with this card versus another card you may be looking at. Basically, if you can get it at a good deal, then you can absolutely still play games in 2020 on this card. Again, especially if you're looking at lower demanding games. Valorant can run on like a potato, so this GPU gives you excellent performance. But of course, then you're battling other things like age, like what kind of condition was this card kept in? Is it still in good operating condition? Did it see a lot of use, a little bit of use? It's just hard to account for all those types of things. So in summary, if you already have one of these cards and the games you play are still running just fine on it, then really there's not a huge reason to upgrade. You're still getting performance out of a card that's from the 2012 era. If you're looking at at putting together a budget system, unless you're getting a very good deal on the 7970, it's probably better to look elsewhere. But of course, these videos are not complete unless you give me a little bit of feedback, especially those of you out there that are running a card like the 7970, or maybe you're running the rebranded R9 280X, which is effectively an HD 7970. Let me know what kind of performance you're getting in some of the games that you still play. Are you still happy with this GPU? Are you looking to upgrade it in the near future? Let me know all your thoughts in those comments down below. And of course, if you liked the video and you want to see more like it, give this video a like, share, subscribe, comment. All those things are extremely helpful for the channel. You can follow me both on Instagram and on Twitter at Hoosier Hardware. And as always, I'll let YouTube queue up a couple more videos from my channel for you to watch. I'm Shane with Hoosier Hardware, and I'll see you guys in the next video.